Hi everybody, I'll be discussing about behaviorism by B.F. Skinner, chapter 11, The Self and Others. So in the introduction of chapter 11, Skinner addresses how others view the science of behavior, and many believe that the science of behavior studies the human organism, but it neglects the person or self, which is not true. Excuse me. Skinner acknowledges that we are people, and in acknowledging that we are people, he contributes our behaviors to our genetic and environmental makeup. And he talks about the negligence of animism, which is the body being moved by one or more indwelling spirits. He discredits the idea of personalities by arguing that personalities aren't solely just personalities themselves, and that they are a set of skills, and the personalities are due to reinforcement. Skinner then begins to talk about how we actually know oneself. So Skinner poses the question, how do we actually know who we are, or whom can know about whom? And he gives the example of the tennis player getting mad at himself, which the tennis player and himself will be thought of as two separate entities within the same body. He then talks about how the idea of describing ourselves comes from a verbal community. And he talks about the different types of communities being able to affect how we actually see and describe ourselves based upon the contingencies. For example, people who are deeply rooted in a certain religion may act a certain way based upon whether they may go to hell, which would be a punishment, or heaven, which would be a reward for the individual. So if someone asks them to do something that's against their religion, they may not do so because it's against their religion, and if they do, something bad may happen. And if they partake in that certain behavior, then they may be disappointed in themselves or upset with themselves due to a set of rules and contingencies around those rules. And another example is yoga, which he talks about, and I'm partially familiar with it because in the mental health field, we try to teach the clients mindfulness so that they're aware of their surroundings, themselves, and other people, but mostly themselves. And it dismisses any thoughts about the past or the future, and it focuses on the present. So from a behaviorist perspective, it would take away from actually seeing how different things in the environment have shaped our behavior. So let's say that the individual had been practicing mindfulness and they had mastered it and become aware of themselves. And then one day an incident which had never occurred before occurs, and the individual didn't know what to do, and they end up getting upset and displaying certain behaviors. And there was a change in the contingency which changed the learned behavior of mindfulness. And then he could say that he wasn't himself, but it was the incident that occurred that he wasn't prepared for, which caused a disruption in his practice of mindfulness. Skinner then talks about knowing another person. So how do we actually know other people? And Skinner uses two words that stood out when getting to know others, which is sympathy, which is feeling with, and empathy, which is the attribution of feelings. And in order to do this, we actually have to talk to their person and get their account of what has occurred in their life. And then we actually have to question, do we even still know who this person is? And we typically base how other people act based upon how we view others to act in that instance, or what type of behaviors are associated with certain actions. So Skinner tries to explain how we use words to describe feelings, and he believes that we use these words that we use to describe feelings loosely as we put them on inanimate objects. For example, his example about the angry sea. And he discusses how we can be wrong when saying that someone acts a certain way because of their feelings. And I think that he's aiming to show that we won't really know how someone feels unless we see how they react under different contingencies, because feelings are a mentalistic and subjective account to justify why we do what we do and who we are. So we really won't know anyone based upon what they tell us. We have to actually see what they do based upon their actions. And I found it interesting when reading it, because I may view someone else's experiences as something totally different than what they've explained it to be due to my own experiences in the world. So my experience with the same situation could be totally different, and it would kind of be as if I'm thinking about my experience and putting who I am into who they are. And another thing that I thought about while reading was how our behaviors change when we're around different people, and contingencies like code switching. The contingencies are changed, but how can we actually tell who that person is if they're able to code switch? So next, Skinner talks about self-management. And Skinner, again, he asks, who are the managing selves? And he explains again there aren't different personalities. Doing it is basically due to a set of skills that we've acquired under different circumstances. And he talks about the managed self being composed of selfish behavior, which he states is the product of biological reinforcers to which the species have been made sensitive through natural selection, which we see ontogeny and phylogeny play a role. He then talks about the managing self, which is set up by the social environment, which makes a person alter his behavior in a way that becomes less aversive and possibly more reinforcing for others. So in the case that we see consequences of how others may react to certain behaviors, and as human beings, we want to be reinforced by being liked, wanted, or accepted. And he talks about how many believe that self-management is changing the way that you think in order to stop doing something, but it's actually the individual changing the world in which they live. So, for example, if I had a ton of homework to get done, I wouldn't go to the library and start talking very loudly on the phone or to another person across the library, because we've been conditioned to know that we're supposed to be quiet in the library. So if there are other people in the library, I may get weird looks, I might get shushed or asked to leave, which would be aversive to the others around me, resulting in me not being able to complete my homework in the library. So it wouldn't matter that I'm embarrassed or I'm mad about the situation. The concept of self-management is concerned with the consequences regarding how others respond to what we have done. Skinner then talks about managing another person and how we can manage the behaviors of others. And he talks about the practice of operant conditioning, which he says that everything we know about operant conditioning is making behavior more or less likely to occur. And we've learned so far that in operant conditioning, it's learned behavior due to the consequences which have occurred, such as rewards and punishments. So within these rewards and punishments, we describe the contingencies. So Skinner makes a distinction between what it means to arrange contingencies and what it means to describe them. And if we arrange them, we'll be able to produce responses that we're trying to condition. But simply describing them does not have much of an impact on the behavior. It just gives awareness to the individual. Skinner then talks about the self and others, and he typically, we typically like to explain things about ourselves and others because we've been ourselves for years, and you would feel that you know yourself better than others, but there are other components to understand who we are, such as environmental, genetic, and where we currently are, which shapes us. And I'm not the same person that I was 10 years ago because of the different contingencies in the environment that I've experienced. So most of the behaviors that I did when I was 16 aren't reinforced at 26. So I'm the way that I am, and it has nothing to do with introspection. It has everything to do with reinforcement. So in addition to others having an effect on my behaviors, I try to display behaviors that are reinforced, which Skinner talks about in his emotional and motivating measures. And we base our actions upon how others will respond that we interact with. So if we do something pleasing to that person, they'll elicit a response that demonstrates reinforcement. But if we continuously do things that are pleasing, then it won't be reinforced later on. So with all of that being said, my questions are: a common theme between self-knowledge and self-management are based on the repertoires. So what is your understanding of knowing yourself and managing yourself? And another question is, do you think that being able to control others contributes to who we are?